This
Can
conference will now be recorded.
maybe give me a shout out in the chat that you can hear me okay. I appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and get started here in just a second. Great, thank you. Um, so I'm really excited and frankly honored to be asked to speak to the community today. It's morning where I am. I live in South Florida, so the Miami area, probably what you all would know it as, and pretty excited to spend the morning with you and talk about Azure and something that I've been working a lot with in the past year with customers um, all over the world with the Microsoft product groups. Specifically talking about what everyone is doing around migrations, right? And it's a privilege to be able to speak and talk to you about this from such a long way away. Isn't the internet still amazing? I think it's fascinating how people from all over the world can just open a computer and talk to each other like this. So I hope that you're as excited as I am, and I'm going to spend, roughly the next 45 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, talking about Azure migrations and some of the tools and things that I've been working on and the projects that I've seen and how they can be really successful, right? And I think that the most important thing to take away from this is every migration is different, right? We all know that every customer, every situation is different. And so these are ideas, right? They're ideas of things that we have seen that have helped and that have worked. And there's also language in here that I'm going to teach you that you can use so that people from different cultures, from different companies, can use the same words, right? And arrive at common meetings that help you to be successful when you're embarking on these projects, right? Um, and really quick, if anybody's excited about maybe coming over to the U.S. and coming to the first ever Microsoft Azure and AI conference, it's in early December, but I'm going to be speaking there and about DevOps and Azure CLI and doing actually a workshop on DevOps for artificial intelligence. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, look up the Microsoft Azure and AI conference. It should be a lot of fun. But let's jump in and let's talk about Azure. Now, what I'm going to introduce you to here, and if you watched any of the Microsoft Ignite that we had here, and it was actually in Florida, in Orlando, in late September. I spoke there with the Microsoft Migration Product Group about this, and you're basically going to see the talk that I gave to the people that was there today. And we're going to walk through some of this guidance and really all summer, starting about last April, all through the summer, I worked with the Microsoft Azure Migration Product Group to write a series of 14 articles, okay, that are focused on different types of migrations. And I'm going to walk through some of that today. And actually, we're working on some more. Actually, this month, we're going to be publishing 3 more articles about best practices specifically around migrations. And I'm going to set you up here with the information and talk through what that guidance looks like. And it will help you to understand what your options are. And it's been reviewed fairly well. People are very excited about it, and once again, it's really helping you to get into this, right? So when we talk about migrations, there's a lot of different approaches, right? And I think that the important thing is to try to make this consumable as possible, right? And Microsoft has come up with this sort of 4 buckets of where a migration is, and you might have applications or systems that are in different ones of these buckets at any given time, right? But in general, if you look sort of left to right here, first we have assessment, right? We cannot migrate what we don't understand, okay? So we need to understand what is out there in order to move it to Azure, right? Or frankly, maybe decide to not move something, right? And so once we've assessed those things, then obviously we would look at migrating them, right? And there's a lot of different ways to migrate. We're going to talk through some of that today. And um, but the migration is the part where we get it to Azure. But the story's not done there, right? Really, there are ongoing activities that need to happen when we're have our workloads out in Azure, right? And when we talk about optimize here, really we're talking about sizing, we're talking about money spent, right? So the cost to have the the workload out there, right? Um, and then of course securing and managing, right, which is critical in today's world. Okay. um, and so that's sort of the process, and there's a bunch of things, right? You see this, it says we have migration tools, we have the Azure Migration Center, we have the scenario guidance, we have the fast track program, and other things that are available for customers to use. But in the end of the day, there are fundamental foundation best practices around for what we've talked about maybe for a decade or more with people, process, and technology, right? And we threw planning in there too, because planning is a part of the process. We cannot, have a successful migration or expect success without doing some planning, right? So we're going to talk about all of that here today and get you started on obviously a path to success. So the next thing that I want to do here is talk about this customer scenarios that we built out, and the idea is to give you information along this same journey, right? So the first thing, let's look at some of the tools potentially that are an option for you. So when we look at assessment, when we're trying to understand what we have, the migration tools, and this is directly from Microsoft. Obviously, there's other ones, talk about that in a minute. But from a Microsoft perspective, we have the Azure Migrate tool, okay, which will interrogate either Hyper-V or VMware. Now, Hyper-V is still in preview, but you can do it, where we're looking at what virtual machines are running today on premises, and what their workload types are like, that sort of thing. And then from a data perspective, we have the Data Migration Assistant, where we can evaluate databases as they sit today, and then leverage that to help inform our decisions around our migrations, right? The SQL Server Migration Assistant is also there. Once again, it's an assessment tool. So when you run this tool, it'll tell you, if you have SQL running on a VMware VM today, SQL Server, is it compatible like with Azure SQL Database or not, right? That's the type of thing that we're trying to evaluate to help inform our options, right? And then once again, we will move then obviously to the migrate piece, and Microsoft has three types of tools here. We have the Azure Site Recovery tool, which you might be familiar with. This is really a disaster recovery tool, but it is also a tool that can be used for migrations. The same way that we take an on-premises workload today and we're able to fail it to Azure, right? We can fail it back. That's the BCDR, or the business continuity disaster recovery, that we're looking for from a disaster type of scenario or a solution. But with ASR for migrations, essentially what we do is we fail over to Azure, but then we just leave it there, right? We never fail it back. And so it's permanently in Azure. So that's how we use it as a migration tool. And it's also free as a migration tool like that. We have the Azure Database Migration Service, which has just gone into GA around the time of Ignite. This will help us to move databases, right? So we have databases on-prem. You can actually move them. You can move them offline. You can move them online. It's an absolutely fantastic tool to move databases. In GA for SQL Server, but is in preview for MySQL. And Microsoft is continuing to look at helping people move those workloads. So if I had a CentOS Linux box on-prem. It's got MySQL 5, 5.6 or something on it. I could migrate that database up to Azure and put it into Azure database for MySQL PaaS services, right? And get rid of the VM. And then the final one here is Azure Databox. And what Databox is it is a method for importing data, right? You might be familiar with the Azure import export service, as it's known, where we can move large amounts of data to Azure. Originally, when this service came out, and it's been in GA for a very long time, you would have to mail your own hard drives, right, to Microsoft. With the data box, you can buy a drive from Microsoft, and you can put data on there and then encrypt it and send it to Microsoft. And there's some new options for that. There's very large ones. There's even going to be one that looks sort of like a crate. You need maybe a truck or something to bring it into your data center because it's up to a petabyte of data. So very large. For optimization, we have Azure Cost Management. This is a tool Microsoft acquired called Cloud-In and has now been integrated. And then with Secure and Manage, we have Azure Security, Security Center, backup, monitoring, all sorts of things to manage and monitor our systems. And then there's huge number of partners, right? So we have a lot of partner systems out there, Cloudimize, Turbonomic, there's all sorts of Zerto solutions that do the same thing, but there's additional costs and you're working with a partner. So if we keep moving here, when we look at the migrations scenarios, right? When we look at migration scenarios, we look at apps, data, infrastructure, all these things that are on-prem today. And there's three different kind of universes here. So we have migration and modernization, or we have cloud native or SaaS types of applications, right? Now, if you look at the words below here, you'll see rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, replace. These are the terms that you want your teams to use and you yourself should adopt. These are becoming industry terms now, okay, that are very well known. So when we talk about rehosting, effectively what that would be is, moving your application up to Azure as it is. Okay, it's VM on-prem. It's going to become a VM on the cloud. Refactoring might be, well, we'll take it and maybe change it. So maybe it's a Windows, .NET, and SQL application. It runs on virtual machines on-prem, but when we move it to the cloud, we're going to move it to PaaS services. So maybe it becomes Azure App Service with web apps, right? So PaaS, and Azure SQL Database PaaS. So we don't have the VMs anymore, and then we're refactoring it, if you will. Maybe a little bit of change to the code, probably none, but possibly a little bit. But it's the same application, but in a different factor, right? And then re-architecting would be when we move it to the cloud, but we change it. A lot of times re-architect tends to be moving to like a container sort of infrastructure, something like that, that sort of thing. Maybe move it to Service Fabric or Kubernetes, something like that. And down below, we're looking at the next over there would be where we rebuild it. Right? We have an application and we're going to rebuild it. It's cloud native. We're moving to maybe serverless, Azure Functions, microservices, this sort of thing, right? And so that's kind of what we're going to focus on here. Quick question here. Somebody asks, how do you to move on-prem data for Teradata database to Azure? So Teradata is a different kind of animal. There are Teradata virtual machines and this sort of thing that Teradata has in the Azure marketplace. The data itself might be very large, so maybe with Databox you would get the data up there and then you'd have to import it back into some sort of Teradata kind of infrastructure. Somebody was asking me to highlight on the screen. I guess whoop, it just moved. Anyway, sorry about that. So let's move on to the scenario guidance here. So let me talk about this. And if you look at the bottom, you can see this URL, right, to this Contoso documentation that I was speaking of. So these are 14 detailed guides that we wrote over the last 6 months to help with a scenario. Of course, we're using Contoso, our famous fake company at Microsoft, and we built out a Contoso network, right? And what we did is we said, what does it take to start from nothing and move to the cloud? Right. And the idea is that this was a proof of concept. Contoso needed subscriptions. They need a network. They need Azure AD. They need to establish standards, right? Like, what are the resource groups names? What are their virtual networks going to look like? How are they going to do site to site? How are they going to do VPNs? All these things, right? I kind of call that Azure setup.exe if you're from the old world, right? Like, how do you set up Azure? And then from there, we chose two applications. One is a Windows Server, SQL Server, 2008 R2 application, and another is a LAMP application, so Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. And the idea is we would take those two applications. One of them is called Smart Hotel. The other one is a help desk application. And let's go through and migrate them in all of those different ways, right? So what would it be like if we rehosted it? What would it be like if we refactor it to PaaS? What would it be like if we moved it to containers? Right? So it's the same base application coming from the same network. You can see kind of on the left there the vCenter with a couple of VMs. And then what would it be like if we did it over and over again, but the different possibilities, right? And so we looked at what would their business drivers be for each one of those scenarios? What would their migration goals be? What would the walkthrough be like? Okay. And so these two applications we basically took and wrote all these articles for you so you can understand the application and then say, well, what would it be like if it was just VMs? What if I made it more highly reliable VMs? What if I took it to PaaS? What if I made it into containers? What if I refactored it and I turned it into functions and used AI and things like that? Okay. And so you can first understand the infrastructure that they built, and then you can look at all the different possibilities, right, that your customers or your company would need to do these different types of migrations. Okay. So, get that aka.ms Contoso migration, and you will have all of this at your fingertips. So let's look at a couple of them. So here's a first one. So here's an example of rehosting an app to Azure IaaS and moving to the new Azure SQL database managed instance, right? So the picture here we see simple. We've got a web VM and a SQL VM, and it's running on premises, and it's managed by VMware. So we've got a vCenter. And this is a traditional three-tier application, Windows SQL Server, R2. And their goals were they wanted the same performance that they currently have in VMware. The team doesn't want to invest in the application, so they're not trying to change it. They just want to move it. Okay. And then they had a scenario where their database doesn't meet the requirements of Azure SQL database, but they want to use some sort of platform as a service solution. Okay. And so in this case, we used Azure IaaS for a VM for the web VM, and then we used the Azure Database Migration Service to move the data over to SQL, right? SQL managed instance. So this is what that looks like, right? So Azure Site Recovery is going to migrate the VM to Azure IaaS, right? So you see this preparation phase and the migration phase. And then the Database Migration Service is going to move the database to SQL, right? So on the left, we have our database and our web server. We've got, let's see, so like here, and here, Okay, and we're going to go this way, obviously, right? So we've got our preparation phase. We're going to configure Azure Site Recovery for the web VM. We're going to configure our vCenter so that it's set up and we can interrogate the VMs. Then we're going to replicate those VMs over to Azure, right? And we're going to perform a migration using Azure Site Recovery. So the VM that was here becomes this VM, and this goes away, right? And then here, we're only going to take the database, right? We want the database to come. So we're going to provision a managed SQL database in Azure. We're going to provision the data migration service, and then we're going to use that service to migrate the data to here. So what ends up happening is we lose the VM, and only the database is now up in our managed instance, okay? So that's one potential option, and there's a lot of other options potentially, right? Now, to do this, we show you how you set this up, right? So we need a site-to-site VPN, obviously. We need to be able to talk to Azure, right? We need our SQL database set up. We need the migration service set up. We need ASR to be able to talk to our migration service, right? We need that here, and we need it to send our VM, right? Okay, and obviously these two machines are going to go away. Okay, so we have our VPN with our VPN gateway. Our web VM is now going to be running in Azure. We've got domain controllers, obviously, that we set up so people can still log in and that sort of thing. And remember, there are PCs and users over here on this network. So they're going to come across the VPN now and talk to the web VM. And that web VM is going to talk across a peering to SQL managed instance where our database is now. Okay. What this machine is this is a secured access workstation that allows us to talk to this machine because you can't connect to it directly. So this is the type of detail that we're going to give you, and I will show you, what like this particular article looks like in a minute, and you'll get kind of a feel here. And actually, I'll just go ahead and do that now. Let me bring up the documentation. So if you go to that URL that we had, you'll get to this Contoso migration overview web page, right? And you'll be able to see all of these articles. And here they are, all of them. Look how many of them there are. Okay, so this was Contoso rehost an app to Azure with SQL database instances. This is the one we just talked about. So if I click on that one, what you'll see is basically all of the information about this, right? So what were their business drivers? What were their migration goals? What's the design? Here's the current architecture. Here's that proposed architecture. That's from the slide. Here are considerations about the databases, what to think about. What are the pros and cons for the solution that they've designed? And then what's that process? And then here's the thing, let me scroll down a little bit for you. So we show you then what are the steps to actually do that. And here we go. Look, it even has step by step. So all of these scenarios do this, folks. You can go through and literally see how end to end, what the ideas were, the concepts, understand the design, and then we'll show you a step by step of what we did. Okay? This is extremely powerful. Every one of these is like this. There is nothing like this that we can find anywhere for any other cloud provider. This type of guidance, where we take an application and show you all the ways that you can do it in Azure. Okay? Look at this one. This one is the same app, but here it's using SQL always on availability groups. So before we had SQL PaaS, here is SQL IaaS. Same application, but a different approach. Once again, step by step. Look here, look at the step by step. Setting up a cloud witness, doing clustering. What's the code look like? Okay, this is very, very powerful. If you read these documents, you will know all the different ways to do it. Look at here's one for Linux, right? So this one is a different application, right? This is the application is called OS Ticket. And look, we're going to use Azure Database for MySQL here, right? So again, same situation, but this time we're doing it with MySQL, right? Okay. So let's go back here and keep going on our talk. So when we talk about refactoring, typically that has to do with containers. Okay, so with containers, and I'm not really going to go into containers and how what they are per se, but it's very important to learn these and understand it. I'd encourage you to go read about containers. Okay, but in Microsoft you can do container instances, Kubernetes, Azure Service Fabric, and you can even use the app service, right? So this scenario, we have the refactor of on-prem to Azure Web App and Azure SQL Database. So again, this is the same application that we had before, but this time we're refactoring it. So no VMs, no virtual networks, none of that. And we have DevOps pipelines. So a web app and the service are deployed to Azure App Services. The database for the app is deployed to Azure SQL DB. And then the solution is built and deployed using an Azure DevOps pipeline. Okay? So this takes that same application that a minute ago we were talking about VMs, and this is all PaaS and DevOps. Okay? That one is right here. Let's see. Azure SQL Database Refactor, Azure Web Apps, and Azure SQL DB. So this is going to take you through each part. Provision the database, migrate it using the migration assistant, provisioning the web apps, setting up the DevOps pipeline. Look at this. It shows you how to import the repos, get the connection strings, update them, build a DevOps pipeline to do this. If you've never done this sort of thing, it walks you through it, okay? And you can do this on your own. You can download the app from GitHub and you can follow along and you can do this on your own, all right? So pretty neat stuff. So this is what it looks like for that. This is a little bit more complex view of refactoring, using containers, but here we've got GitHub. You might be familiar with Jenkins, which is for DevOps pipelines, using third-party or OSS, Azure Container Registry, that sort of thing. A little bit more complex, right? We don't have a scenario for this one, but you can absolutely do this sort of thing. Let's take a look at re-architecting with Service Fabric. So here we convert the application to Service Fabric. So before, what was running on virtual machines now is running on a managed Service Fabric cluster of containers in Azure. We've got an Azure DevOps pipeline that's going to build the Docker containers. It's going to put it in Azure Container Registry, right? And then it's going to be deployed out into Service Fabric. And then it's also extended with a Twitter feed, Cosmos DB, this sort of thing, right? Remember, this is re-architecting, right? This is getting more complex. People want to move their old applications from SQL Server 2008, Windows 2008, use containers, and then integrate it with new technologies like Cosmos DB and things like this, right? And using the database migration service to get there, okay? All right, cool. Well, I hope that you thought that that was interesting. So I'm going to move now from the scenarios over to some more best practices, right? And these are more to answer the questions like, how do I get my company started? What tools should I use? How do I stay on top of my environments? What factors should I consider? So all these sorts of questions. And this is where it's much more about the process and the people, right? So the planning, the technology, people, process, and technology is what people like to talk about, right? And that's really what we're focusing on here, okay? Now, if we look at these a little bit, from a people's perspective, one of the hardest things is driving change. People are very hard to change. When they know something works, they don't want to touch it because it's going to break, right? That's what they're worried about. And so, that first thing of driving the organization to change, moving forward, that sort of thing. We recommend for big companies that you set up a migration center of excellence, or COE as we call it. And the idea is that people need to focus and learn on these technologies, right? If they don't focus, they won't ever learn, they won't do it. We have to make sure that executives and stakeholders are engaged. And we need to train people. People need to learn, they need to get their certifications, this sort of thing. And then when you need help, to use migration partners. Maybe some of you work for migration partners, right? So your customers are going to reach out to you. Now, from a planning perspective, companies need a business case to do this, right? They need to be able to prove why it's going to save money or why it's better. And then they need to build a strategy. And one of the most important things that we talked about is starting small and doing a pilot. The worst thing for a cloud migration is take a really important app, put it in the cloud, and it doesn't work well. That will stop any migrations from moving forward, right? And so, this is the type of thing where we want to start small, something that's not critical, and we can make progress with that. People can learn this sort of thing. And then having a scorecard, right? How many migrations have we done? How well have they gone? And then tracking and optimizing the cloud spend so we make sure that people save money. And then, of course, from the technology perspective, I think that one of the most important pieces of advice I would give is this first one. Choose the right tools for the job, okay? If you need to dig a small hole in your backyard, right, you don't get a large bulldozer, right? You just get a small shovel, okay? If you have a small thing to do, use a simple tool and get it done. Don't overcomplicate it, right? Just get the work done. That's what we need to do, right? And then, governance for our environments is very important. Security, foundations, right? Making sure we start with security in mind for everything we do and using least privilege. Give your administrators and your users and your networks the least amount possible. Start with no access and give them only the right access until they have enough, and that's it, right? And of course, network and identity are critical. Network and identity are critical. Look right here. You see this right here? This is your you have to check this off before you do anything. You have to connect the network, and then you have to have identity in place. If people can't log in, what's going to happen? Nothing, right? If you don't have a good network, nothing's going to happen, okay? So this is the sort of thing that we need to make sure happens. Now, when we're setting up this migration center of excellence, having that team do the assessment, that sort of thing, they're the team that is really going to be on the hook to make the migration work, right? And then having, and especially for larger organizations, having migration teams that are assigned to individual areas is probably important as well. If you have application developers that work in your finance organization, they might not be the same people that work on applications in the manufacturing organizations. And so you need to have the right teams in place and make sure that everyone knows what their responsibilities are. Now, when we look at some of these strategies, there's different drivers, right? That kind of dictate what we're going to do. You effectively are redesigning everything that the company does. Think of it like that. So everything they've ever done in IT, when you're moving from on-prem to the cloud, you should rethink everything. It's your chance to fix the problems that you've seen for a long time, right? Now, the one thing that we say, people ask, well, like when do I rehost versus, right? When do I do these, right? Like, how do I decide? And that's what we're trying to tell you here with this one, right? So what we say is that if you have time-oriented triggers, like I need to be out of the data center in 3 months, right? You're going to have to do this. You don't have a choice. If you have some time thing, a lot of people have contracts for co-location facilities or for They've been purchased, the company's been purchased by another, and it needs to be done by a certain time. That's when you just need to rehost and get out as fast as you can. Take your VMs on-prem, put them in Azure, make them work, then figure it out. If not, if you have business priorities, right? Right, you want to get more customers, you have a new marketing strategy for new applications, things like that, then we look at, should we just refactor it? Should we re-architect it? Should we rebuild it? So business priority versus timeline. That's how you come up with what you should do and when. Now, keeping track, extremely important. This will show the executives and the customers, what's been discovered, what have we assessed, what's been migrated, and then which are we doing how, right? Okay. Keeping track like this is good. It's good for the team. It's good for morale. Are we doing a good job? Are we making progress? Are we getting things done? Mr. Customer, we've now migrated, whatever this is, right? Equals sum. What's the sum of these? We've migrated, 50 applications or something. And keeping track of this number will give the client or give your managers confidence. Now, let's talk about best practices, okay? I'm going to spend some time here. We're getting through our talk, and I really want to talk through almost each one of these because I want to give you my experience. My company, we've migrated about 25,000 applications to Azure. And in these buckets, these are the things that I would say for each one. So let's spend some time looking at these. So with assessments, first, you need to build an inventory of the applications, databases, virtual machines, and servers you have. Okay? That inventory you need to have because without it, you will be lost. Okay? When you build that inventory, you should create, if you don't already have one, or you should update what we call a service catalog. A service catalog is the list of services that IT provides the business. Okay? What services do you provide to them? And then you need to align those services to the business. Okay? You need to be able to tell the business, these are all the applications, all the services that we know of that we give to you. And then they need to tell you, is it true or not? Because the next thing I'm going to tell you is one of the most important things. Beware of departmental applications, databases, and reports. Okay? When you have a company that's been around for 10, 20, 50, 100 years, they will have reports, databases, little applications that they've either bought or they run or someone designed for them that you may or may not know about that is not in your catalog, right? And if you don't know where those are, you will take people down, right? Okay, so this is a critical step. Understand everything you have, aligning it to the service that's provided to the business, and then go and find the things that you don't know about, right? Sometimes we'll call it shadow IT. You'll hear that term where it means, systems that are critical to the business that IT doesn't know about, right? Then the next thing is once we have that list, assign priority, complexity, and risk to all of the items. You need to put some metadata to it, right? So when we have and we understand the risk of the application and we understand its complexity and we've rated them and we have priority, then we can look at coming up with this, which is some good POC candidates. Remember earlier I said start small, start with something not important, okay? So if I've built my inventory, I have a service catalog and the business agrees and we know what everything is, then we assign priority, complexity, and risk to those. Then we can come up with an order. We can come up with what's important, right? From there, then we want to look at and be redesigning every application. Yes, you heard me right. You want to redesign every application for the cloud. We had that old VM with SQL Server 2008 and Windows 2008 R2. Remember that one, the Smart Hotel application? We redesigned that application to use PaaS. Then we solved the problem of being on a 10-year-old operating system, and we never have to manage a VM anymore. No more security updates, no more SUS, no more firewalls for that, none of that, because it's now PaaS. We redesigned the application and we made it so much simpler for us to use, right? Now, one word of caution: higher security applications, those that talk to the outside and integrate with firewalls, it is critical that you understand those configurations, right? Think about it. You're not just taking an application and a database and migrating it to the cloud. You also have to migrate how people get to it and how you manage it and how you keep hackers away from it, right? So when you actually do the migration, that's the way you should think of it. You should think of, how do people access it? How do I keep hackers out of it? And then those configurations need to be moved to the cloud too. Maybe, unless you're refactoring it and maybe you don't have a firewall for it anymore because you don't need one, right? So that's the way to think about assess, okay? Now, next, migrate. Remember what I said before: choose the right tool for the job and be flexible. Do not force people to use a tool just because you want them to use a tool, okay? If you could move 30 applications by using a simple tool and you have to move another 20 using a more complex tool, that's fine, right? We want to get things moved. We don't want to slow them down by forcing them to do things that that don't make sense, okay? Now, it's obviously your choice. You can do whatever you want to do, but my thing is being flexible. Sometimes it makes sense to use the database migration service for complex mission critical databases. Yes. For very simple databases, use the database migration assistant. It does migrations too. One click, it sends the data, it's done. The database migration service, you have to set up all kinds of things to make it work. It works fantastically, and the database doesn't have to come down. That's the big difference, right? So it depends on the situation. Now, here's another great tip for migrations. Part of the migration, and frankly, part of the risk of a migration, is when you're doing things like moving data, installing applications, doing configurations, this sort of thing, right? So, select more powerful sizes of your Azure resources during the migration. What I mean is, if you have to crunch a bunch of data on a virtual machine, okay, maybe it's doing a restore, maybe whatever it is doing, if you can scale it up to use something with 20 cores and 64 gig of RAM for the migration, it's only going to be that for an hour. So it'll be 10 times faster than what you need for that hour while you're crunching the data. As soon as you're done, put it down to 4 cores where it's going to be for the next 10 years, right? So use the ability of the cloud. Scale it up during the migration. When the migration is done, then scale it back down, right? That makes the migration go faster. So if you're doing a migration at 3 o'clock in the morning, instead of sitting there for 2 hours while it crunches data, maybe it crunches data for 25 minutes, right? This is the type of thing that we need to use the cloud to do. It does it, so do it. So use more powerful sizes during the migration and then scale down for after the migration. Involve the business at every step. We do not want the Monday madness. Make sure you have testers. Perform non-disrupting testing before you do the cutover, right? Test. Remember what I said. The way to kill a good cloud migration is to have one application go wrong, especially early in the process, which goes to the next one, which is start with the easy, then move to the hard, especially for teams that have never done this before. Do simple applications that don't cause you problems. Okay? Once those are done, then move on to the hard ones, right, guys? You don't want to do the hardest one first. That's crazy. Do the easiest one first and then move on to the hard. Okay, last two. Optimize. Use the Azure Cost Management tool. It's free. If the customer has software assurance, right, which is a Microsoft licensing thing, we want them to use that. Use the hybrid benefits. It saves them money. It can be used for Windows and SQL. If you have a predictable workload, use reserved instances. Like you know how many servers you're going to need for SAP for the next 10 years, right? Have the customer sign up for reserved instances, and with hybrid use, they can save 80%. That's real money that you can save them, right? That's justification right there for the move. Scripts, automation should be used to shut down VMs that aren't needed. If you don't need virtual machines 24/7, use scripts, use Azure automation. Turn them on in the morning when people get them, turn them off at night, right? If you do that times 100 VMs, you'll save incredible amounts of money. If you just let them sit there, then you're literally wasting money, right? Now, clean up your migrations. Migrations leave a lot of, I would call it digital litter, right? Like trash. Leftover backups like one-time backups, things sitting in blob storage, VHDs, snapshots, anything that's not being used needs to be cleaned up. Because what will happen is if you don't clean it up fairly immediately, like within a week or two, you move on to something, everybody moves on, and all of a sudden the company is giving Microsoft money for free to store blobs from a migration that happened a year ago. Okay, this is not very cool. Now, last piece, migration and security. The migration isn't complete until it's fully operationalized. Okay, should be with monitoring, backup, failover. Make sure that it is operational. Just putting the application up there is not enough. Do you have backup set up? Can you do DR for it? Are you monitoring it? Anything that you did before, you need to do again, and it has to be reconfigured for a workload now in Azure. Use partner solutions. Obviously, that makes sense. Leverage Azure automation, things like Terraform, Chef, Ansible. When you're doing these migrations, manage it. Stop doing things by hand, right? Learn a new way to do things. Make it easier. Humans mess up. Computers do what they're told. That's part of why I started using computers. Now, if you don't tell the computer to do the right thing, it will mess up. Okay? So use things like Security Center, log analytics, this sort of thing to be successful. Now we're getting a little short on time, so I want to kind of finish up here. You want to manage your Azure environments with governance, right? There's a brand new thing I highly recommend that you look into called Azure Blueprints. Azure Blueprints are extremely important, right? They allow you to standardize your environments, okay? You can add environments with a single click. And then they're compliant with things like GDPR in Europe, FedRAMP in the United States, HIPAA, any kind of laws, things like that that are out there. Now, I mentioned earlier there are two key things that you must do in order for any migration to work and before they even start. The first is extending your network to Azure, right? So creating a hybrid network, maybe with ExpressRoute, VPN failover, things like that. Look up the Azure reference architectures, right? Azure reference architectures are out there for you, and you can find those online, right? The Azure reference architectures are extremely valuable to help you to get started, right? To help you, um, get and understand the different ways that you can set up your network. Here, I'm going to paste this in here for you. There's a URL to that, right? Okay, so that is extremely important. Now, once your network is extended, obviously the next thing is we need identity, right? So synchronizing our Active Directory that's on premises today to the virtual network and Azure setup that we've built, right? And being able to manage and log into and this sort of thing. And extending those IDs out onto the internet. With Azure Active Directory, you can extend the ID and password of a user, say, beyond your network to something like Dropbox or Salesforce or this sort of thing, right? So that we are then able to manage their access to those, and we can manage their passwords to those, and they're logging in like to salesforce.com using the same credentials, right, as they're using for logging into their PC, logging into Office 365, this sort of thing, right? That's what we're looking for. Okay, and they must be able to do that in order to be successful, right? So if you think about getting started, what I would say is that here's a few more links to get you going. I placed the migration links for the scenarios into the window there. And ultimately, it's really for you to learn and share and know how to do this, right? So understanding what the costs are, how do you use the tools, how do you migrate, finding these resources, and then ultimately designing and making these migrations happen for customers. It's for you to do, and it is a very, very neat new world. And so with that, my talk is done. And I hope that you learned something today, and I hope that you'll teach me and share your experiences. You can find me on Twitter um, at Delta Dan is my name. I'm going to put that into the window as well. And I hope that you have a wonderful evening on your side of the world. I'm going to go have a sunny day here in Florida. And I hope that this talk was good for you. Take care. Good luck. And God bless you all.
Hey Dan, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, this was a really informative session for everyone who have joined, I believe, yes. And thank you. Thanks a lot for considering my request and making out the time for presenting this session.
Yeah,
And we look
absolutely.
forward for more such session from you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to be, as I said, in Las Vegas in December talking about DevOps. So maybe what we
Okay.
could do is, in January, I could come back and do a session about DevOps. How does that sound?
Wow, yeah, that's really sounds good.
Okay,
I
well,
hope
that's great.
everyone who is in who have joined the meeting would be excited right from now
Yeah,
for having the session in January. I will surely reach you out and we will plan the dates and all.
sounds
And
great.
very best of luck for your coming session of December, that is AI shop.
Yeah. Thank you. God bless
Thank
everybody.
you.
Take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Bye
Dan.
bye.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks all. Bye. Thanks all. Bye.